Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 101, we sit down with Ann Smith, a member of the Southold Town Board, whose life and career bring a fascinating perspective to our conversation. Ann shares stories of her ancestry and her formative years in upstate New York, reflecting on the experiences that shaped her. We explore her college years and her journey to Long Island, as well as her early passion for education that led her to impactful roles as a principal and superintendent across various school districts, and then shares her path to the North Fork and her time with the Mattituck-Cutchogue School District. Finally, we delve into her decision to run for Southold Town Board, her commitment to key issues, and her hopes for the community's future. Now, before we dive into this episode, we're welcoming Ann Smith back to reflect on our conversation and to share some personal insights on grief and loss. Her thoughts offer a meaningful introduction to our discussion, adding another layer to her story.
Yeah, so thank you. When we met in May and when I left, I realized there are a few things I wish I had kind of said up front in the actual recording, because I'm realizing that when someone's telling their story, it's not just their story. And so I thought a lot about when you and I sat down and we were going to start the interview. I knew you were going to get to a point in the interview, in the podcast, asking me about what led to running for office. And that's when I realized I was going to have to share a very personal loss in my life that resulted in a very complex grieving process. And I realized that you didn't know that that was going to be coming. So I thought, well, the listeners kind of might not know that either. So it'd be good to maybe share what I've reflected on since then. Mm-hmm. And I really started thinking about how people do appreciate, kind of knowing what it's really like when a family experiences a sudden, it's called an out of order complex loss. So when my son, when Ron's son, when Jacob's brother, when Rebecca's brother died suddenly and unexpectedly in August of 2021, enough time had gone by the time we met that had become part of who I am and part of who my children are and my husband is, and all of Caleb's friends have been working to integrate this into their lives. And I think we live in a culture where grief is expected to have an end date. And what I've come to know and want listeners to know when we kind of get to that part, although it's quick in our conversation, when a young person dies suddenly and the family is impacted by that, it really has an impact on who you are, on your identity. And I really simply wanted people to know that carrying something that can't be fixed is hard to hear about. I think it's also important that people recognize and see that in another person, because I think we have a tendency to sort of either look away or hope it's over. And I think as a culture, we could do a little better job of talking about it. And so when I left and really started thinking about it, I thought this should be part of an introduction, that this story is going to include the truth about what happens and the pain a family experiences that did lead me to take a new path in my life. And it's not you're channeling grief. It's you're integrating this experience. And I think listeners just might want to have that heads up, right? So when you think about issues around behavioral health, about substance use disorders, about the what happened to us with fentanyl being, what resulted in his death, the unknowing use of, the whole story is just painful, and yet it does become part of kind of who we are. So I just thought it would be important to kind of lead with that, and to let people know that, seeing another person's grief is important to them, and yet not making it everything about who they are. So I thought I'd just finish with, there's a woman named Megan Devine who does a lot of work in helping people navigate living with grief. And I just wanted to quote her. She says, "There is not a reason for everything. Not every loss can be transformed into something useful. Things happen that do not have a silver lining. We have to start telling the truth about this kind of pain, about grief, about love, and about loss." So I'm hoping that it just kind of inspires other people to know that there's so many things that can cause grief and loss, and it doesn't even have to be death. It can be other things that people experience. And I think we as a culture could do a better job of acknowledging that and embracing it as living with grief as opposed to getting past it. And that was, really the main reason I wanted to come back in and just sort of give that upfront acknowledgement, so that it's comfortable for me, but also for anybody who listens. Yes,
definitely. I think it's important, like you said, with discussing grief and as a society. I think as a whole, I think that's good to hear from people, and it isn't, I don't think, discussed as much. So I think it's important to have that voice and for you to come back in and share that.
Yeah, thank you. It's helpful to do that, and anything that helps people navigate this kind of situation, I'm happy to be part of.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
We're going to now switch to the interview. This episode was recorded April 24th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's nice to be here.
So I'd just like to start off with a little introduction, where you were born and raised.
Sure. So my parents were born and raised in Albany, New York. And when they got married and my dad started working at General Electric in Schenectady, they bought a house there. So I was born in Schenectady. I have 3 sisters and a brother. And eventually my family kind of moved to Long Island based on work my dad was doing. I was already finished with high school. And moved to Long Island as well, where I went to Dowling College, and then to Stony Brook University, and then New York University, and finally St. John's University. I did finish degrees at all of those places. I was jumping around. And so now my whole family is on Long Island doing different things, different parts of Long Island, mostly in the Bayport, Blue Point, Sayville area.
Wonderful. And then now, in terms of your ancestry, have you been able to, how far back can you go in terms of your ancestry, whether on both of your parents' side?
Yeah, so my father's parents were both immigrants from Ireland. They came to the U.S. not knowing each other, both like 16 years old, met here and got married. So they so my dad's first generation and all of his siblings growing up in Albany. My mom's family is also from Ireland, but her grandmother is from Ireland. So she's her mom was first generation. And my parents went to school together in high school. They were high school sweethearts and did the whole happily ever after business there. So, in fact, I was just up in Albany visiting my father's sister, the only living relative of that generation. And she was just giving my sisters and I this lovely history of like her growing up. So being the youngest, she had a very different perspective than my dad had. So her stories were really fun and interesting. And then we visited like her childhood house and revisited where we grew up. So it was a really nice kind of visit up to our, where we were born. So that's kind of fun.
And they both went to high school together, your parents, and then where was that?
In Albany.
In Albany.
Yeah.
And did their parents, did they come through Ellis Island and...
So my father's parents came through Ellis Island, yes.
Oh, okay. And then they made their way up to...
And then made their way up. My grandfather did work in the South. He did work in coal mines for a bit, and then worked for a railroad company. And he was actually had his own little business of fixing watches. And my grandmother was the matriarch, like the true Rosary Society, like ran things at the church. Nanny she was the boss. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. In fact, we didn't even have her birth certificate. So, people were kind of guessing at her age. I think she lived to 100.
Wow.
Yeah. Good stock. Yeah. She was terrific.
And for your parents, you said your dad was he worked at GE Electric. And what about your mom?
So my mom was home with us. Before she got married, she did work at the telephone company, the operator kind of thing in Albany. So she finished high school, did that, got married. My dad was in the service. He was in the Air Force, and they lived in Mississippi for a while. He was actually a teacher, teaching about radio and radio repair. He's an engineer. And then while I was growing up, he went to Union College and got his degree. Because remember, he graduated on my 7th birthday, and we had a big party. And eventually he became a patenting and licensing engineer, which is what brought him to Long Island. He actually left GE and went with one of the spin-off companies who had developed a new coating for microfiche. And he moved to Long Island and then eventually left that work and became the founding president of the High Technology Incubator at Stony Brook University. So that was under the first governor, Cuomo. That was the founding high-tech incubator, allowing researchers to have low budgets and the infrastructure they need to do their research. And he ran that on campus at Stony Brook.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And
then how many children did your parents have, or siblings?
Yeah, so I have a younger brother, 2 younger sisters, an older sister who's since passed away, and that's us. Yeah. So lots of kids, lots of nieces and nephews, and lots of cousins. It's a big family.
And so growing up in Schenectady, how would you kind of describe, I guess even as a child? So
Schenectady, contrary to what a lot of people on Long Island think, they think everything upstate is a small town. It's a small city. The Tri-Cities, like the capital's there. So we lived in a really nice neighborhood, walking distance to things. The houses were close together. In fact, when we were just up there, when we drove by the house, I thought it was so big. Our house was actually kind of small, and I remember I could talk to the kid next door, like through our windows. Like it was that kind of community where the parents all hung out together. The kids were in the street playing. Really a nice growing up experience. My mom didn't drive until I was, like maybe a teenager. So we walked everywhere pretty much because my dad went to work and she was home with us. Yeah, I was that kid who said, I walked to school. I had to do all of that. It's how it was,
Yeah.
But it was a nice neighborhood to grow up in, yeah.
And in terms of school, and I'm trying to remember, you said in the beginning, how long did you go to school in Schenectady?
I went all through high school. So when growing up, I went to parochial school until 6th grade. And at that point, and I don't really know the reason for this, my parents gave us the choice if we wanted to stay in the Catholic school or if we wanted to go to public school. And I wanted to go to public school. I think my older sister did a little private high school and then went to public school. And we the whole family made the switch. So it was right when I was starting middle school. So it was a pretty big shift for me to go from this small parochial, very strict kind of setting to a public school where there were all kinds of people and all kinds of crowded hallways. And any kid making the shift from elementary to middle school it's a big change. But I loved it. Yeah, I loved every bit of being in a place where, there was more than one section of your grade. And, the teachers were very different. I remember it was like a big deal that I think might have been our English teacher, wore slacks to school. We were like, going from wearing a uniform to I can wear what I want to school, And just the range and the diversity of people was really wonderful for me. I really liked that.
And you talked about the switching. Were your dad and mom on kind of the fence about, you said with Catholic school or public school, were they still really thinking of wanting you to go to
I wish my parents were here for me to dig into that. My younger sister's the historian. I may ask her if she knows, because the only recollection I have is that it was a conversation about did we want to, but we all left, all of us, went off to public school. So I don't know if it was also like a tuition thing. I don't know. I think my dad was starting to have some disagreements sort of in his heart about maybe things that the Catholic Church was doing. I don't know what the actual break in, we still went to that church. We were still very involved in their programs and things there, but it was a big change for sure.
And from what you remember with the public school, you said it was a different environment. How would you describe the demographics or ethnicity of, I guess not Schenectady, but what you kind of saw in the school system?
So the school was much more racially diverse and religiously diverse, and I found that very appealing. It's actually when I started to understand that I wanted to go into teaching. And part of it was there were programs in our public school for students with disabilities. And I started doing some tutoring and working in that field. And that actually is what I ended up going into in my first part of my teaching career, was working with special needs students and helping bring students who were in the public schools in Rocky Point at BOCES programs and advocating for starting in more integrated in-school inclusionary approach. And then that just got me off on my leadership role, because I felt there were things in public school that needed to change, and that was part of what was important to me.
And you mentioned that you were interested in teaching, or that was something of interest in high school. But what would you say was your favorite kind of core classes, or that you gravitated towards with English? Or
Sure. So in middle school and high school, I was a part of the music department. I liked to sing. I liked being involved in the theater arts and anything sort of community service based, student government, that sort of thing. Coursework wise, I would say, the humanities primarily, English and that kind of area.
And then, so coming out of high school, did you kind of know where you wanted to go to school and the exact major you were thinking of?
Well, I knew I wanted to go into teaching. I had considered going to school up at Geneseo, but then decided I had kind of had enough of Upstate and had this opportunity at Dowling to get a dual degree in music and in teaching. And I wasn't really sure what kind of teaching I wanted yet. So I also was kind of making sure I could get a strong foundation. I knew I wanted it to be either in teaching reading or students with disabilities. And that kind of, and then my dad was relocating to Long Island, and my family that's when they were moving down, waiting for my next younger sister to finish high school. Then the other two siblings ended up, going to school here, middle school and high school. So that's kind of what brought me in that direction. And then I had plans to move into New York City. I'd been accepted at a graduate program at Columbia in speech and language. I thought I'd wanted to be a speech and language therapist. Some days I question this change I made. And I took a job. I was recruited to apply for and took a job in the Rocky Point School District, where the administrator then said, have you considered going into administration? And then I met my husband, who was working in the middle school, and here we are,
Yes.
I'm like, oh, all right. So ended up getting my master's at Stony Brook, loving my job, meeting Ron. He was an English teacher in the middle school. Actually met on a informational picket line. I was like, yeah, who's that guy? Walking on that part of the circle. And bit by bit, we got to know each other. And we were just reminiscing about that before I came here today about, remember when we thought we knew what we were doing and said, and decided we should buy a house, like before we had even decided to get married. And we still reminisce, like coming out here and like looking in the windows and not having a clue about how to get a mortgage or any of that, right? But we figured it all out. And we knew we wanted a house that would have room for children. And then I was like, well, I guess then we're getting married, which we did, right in our backyard. So it's been our home since 1985.
And just kind of when you were at Dowling, coming down from Schenectady, what were your kind of initial thoughts on Long Island and a change in environment from upstate New York?
Yeah, it was another big change. So I had one friend in, must have been middle school, who was from Comac. And of course, everyone upstate, just like people on Long Island think everything upstate, everyone has a cow in their yard. I just figured everyone from Long Island lived in a really crowded place. I didn't know anything about it, right? So moving, sort of to the South Fork, or at least the South Shore at the time, the change in what struck me the most was just the change in how much sky there was here. Moving from a valley where there are mountains and hills and lakes, just the whole seashore, the sounds, everything about it was immediately appealing to me. So then I just kind of settled into how could I ever live away from the water.
And then for your interest in school and education, and you eventually started working at Rocky Point, but you mentioned that you were interested in public schools and you had noticed some issues that were going on at that time. And then what was the time frame that you were kind of before you started at Rocky Point? Like, what was that year?
That's a good question. Let me just go back a little bit. Graduating 1978.
Okay.
Did a little traveling, spent some time in California with a good friend. I worked a little bit at a private residential school. It's all coming back to me in Lake Grove. And that was for, students who needed to live on campus kind of thing. Their needs were kind of all inclusive. And I was helping run one of the dormitory programs there. And that's during the time that I then applied to work in a preschool. I lived up in Liberty for a short time, worked at United Cerebral Palsy at a preschool for special needs students. And that's when I think I really got my interest in graduate school and speech and language, and knew that was that was the program I wanted to go to. So the Rocky Point thing started out at first as just sort of like, well, I'm just going to do this for a short time. I'll live with my parents. I'll do this for a little bit. But my goal was to move into New York and see if I could handle New York City after being upstate and on Long Island. So then the Rocky Point thing then turned into a job offer, and, one thing led to another, and then stayed.
And had you visited the North Fork at that time?
Yes. So my husband and I, when we met, when we started dating, one of the things that we loved to do was to bike ride. We were runners and bikers and doing like 10Ks and different bike rides. So we had been bringing our bikes out here for some time. And then when it became clear that we wanted to buy a house and have a life together, we looked as far west as Setauket, and then we looked as far east as East Marion, Shelter Island. We looked in Southampton. We did a long search for either property or a home. So when we found the home that we're in now in Mattituck, we knew pretty quickly, like, this is a place where we would like to raise a family. This is a home we can grow into. And the lifestyle felt good to us. Of course, things have changed a lot. And as low as the cost of our house sounds now, at the time it was like, oh, we're going to have to get like another job. Like we're going to have to work a little more to do this, to make this work, owning a house and paying a mortgage. And
even at that time in the 80s.
Yeah. We were kind of like, this is on the upper edge of what we really should be buying, but decided we would, figure it out. And my husband was in graduate school. He's an English teacher and a social worker, and had a counseling practice. So we were kind of supplementing. I was tutoring or bringing in what we could here and there until I eventually got my job out here, which made things a lot easier.
So you were working at Rocky Point, and from there, did you go to William Floyd School District? How did that come about from switching from Rocky Point?
Right. So what happened was I was a teacher, and then I was department chair, and then the principal there asked me if I would consider getting my degree to become an administrator, because she was going to hire an assistant principal. So that's when I went back to, actually, I'd finished my master's at Stony Brook and then went to New York University to get my postgraduate degree in educational administration. And I did that very quickly because she had this opportunity to hire someone and she wanted me to do it. So I did that and I left teaching. So I left the protection of tenure and walked into administration. And it was right about 1980 when there was a bit of a recession and they eliminated the position I was in. So I found myself, looking for a job. I'm trying to think of what year that all was now. 1980s when I started there. So went off looking for principalship and was hired to run a kindergarten school. They had a kindergarten school in William Floyd at the time, 800 kindergartners all in one place, 400 in the morning, 400 in the afternoon. These kids had 2.5 hours of school. And then we closed that program, and that was after I had my second child. And I shifted over to one of the K-5 schools and worked there until I had my third child, and then had planned to take some time off. But the principal at Cutchogue East retired sooner than he, I think, was going to. And so I found myself in an interview with a 2-week-old at home. And thought, what am I doing? So that was, June. And then in August, I was principal at Cutchogue East. So it happened very quickly.
And then, so how long were you at William Floyd?
So Rebecca was born in 93. So 1990, because it was right after I had Jacob, to 1996. Yeah. Yeah, with little chunk, like I did take time off after I had Rebecca. I had 10 months off and then went back. And then when I had Caleb, it was the end of May of 96, and then I was working here in August of 96.
And just a little bit about working there. How was that environment, and what challenges or improvements that are things that you remember that you were working on there?
Where?
William Floyd.
Okay, William Floyd. So the major part of the work I did in William Floyd, because it was an early childhood program, was really working a lot on the development of the curriculum and teaching practices around early childhood practices. And then when I shifted to the K through 5, we were working on then making the schools a K through 5, not a 1 through, they used to be like 1 through 5. So it was kind of bringing the school together that way. And they were also going through a lot of growth in terms of student population. And so there were building projects going on. So it was also a lot about design and, what do we want the school to be like? The main focus of my work in William Floyd, which is continued to be the focus of my work, but was really important there, was parent involvement, like really making sure we had strong family connections and helping kind of teach the whole child in that context and not simply like marching kids through grades. And so again, focus on curriculum and that's what got me going, eventually into the doctoral program and understanding leadership, accountability. How do we build good programs, and then how do we know if they're working? And
then yes, you mentioned that you switched. Opportunity opened up on the North Fork for principal position at, was it East Cutchogue?
East Cutchogue is actually the correct way to say it, but most people say Cutchogue East, right?
Oh, okay.
But if you grew up here, you would say East Cutchogue.
Oh, okay. And so how long were you there as principal?
So I started as principal in August of 96. We went through a year of study to consolidate with the Laurel School District. So we immediately went into this big project because both districts were growing so rapidly that they needed to expand. And at the time, Mattituck-Cutchogue School District was, the elementary students were in 3 locations. So at what is now the administration office on Depot Lane, that was our kindergarten and first grade. Our 2nd, 3rd, and 4th graders went to school in the front part of what is now Mattituck Junior Senior High School. And our 5th and 6th graders were in what is Cutchogue East. And that's because those were 3 separate school districts at one time. Wow. So over the course of time, which you'd have to interview someone else to get the proper sequence of things there, students who lived in Cutchogue at the time, before the merger of Mattituck and Cutchogue, went to high school in Southold. And again, I don't know the details of how then instead they merged Cutchogue and East Cutchogue and West Cutchogue merged with Mattituck, right? So then it was Mattituck-Cutchogue School District. So when I started, I was driving around to all of those schools because my elementary school was not in one location. And we wanted to build an elementary school for all of the students, and Laurel School was also running out of room. And we got an incentive through Senator Laval's office to consolidate and work on merging the schools and evening out the property tax impact. And so that was a couple years of my first few years, was getting that school built and the merge. And so we shifted. So then the Laurel School became our kindergarten building. So all the kindergartners went there, and all the first graders were in West Cutchogue, and then 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and then we brought 4th grade. So it was like this multi-year shifting until you see what you see now at Cutchogue East, which is, a K through 6.
And it's interesting that you like coming in at that time, a lot of growth and
we could not keep up with the enrollments. We could not keep up. There were so many families moving to the North Fork and building homes, Farm View. We're seeing a lot of growth now, but we saw a lot of growth for families then. So at one point we had 825 students, K through 5. There are now under 500 students in the elementary school.
So it's definitely, I mean, it's how it's switched over that time span is interesting.
Well, we couldn't keep up with it, but I mean, we did because we built the school and we filled it. And then, of course, there was the whole housing issue. You know, people with the mortgage issue, and then people were like, "Oh, we really can't afford this house." And then all the shifts happened from there. Then you had 9/11. Like there were just a series of things that have led to where we are now. There used to be winter rentals. You know, teachers would come in and rent a house from Labor Day to Memorial Day. You know. Those things don't exist now. They're not.
No.
They're not a thing anymore.
And after working there, you became assistant superintendent?
Right. So during the time that I was principal and then decided to go back to school and earn my doctoral degree, I was asked by the school district to start doing more K through 12 curriculum articulation. And so when Jim McKenna was superintendent, he proposed, because I had a full-time assistant who was quite good at the elementary school, asked me to also take on. So it was a dual role. It wasn't like I changed roles. It was added on to my responsibilities to work as assistant superintendent and elementary principal.
And you mentioned the project with the expansion of the school. What were some other things you were working on throughout your years as even assistant superintendent or getting into superintendent for the Mattituck School District?
So a lot was going on during that stretch of time with New York State curriculum changes. There was the whole Common Core curriculum. There started to be this significant pressure on measuring teachers' quality of teaching in a way that the state thought they could quantify by measuring. I'd like to say they were measuring student growth, but they weren't. You know, they were taking a moment in time and testing children, and then deciding that added up to something for teachers. So I worked very hard with our teachers to meet that mandate, but at the same time, try to make sure we were really measuring holistically. Like there's so much more to teaching than a test score. The job of a teacher is so incredibly complex that we worked hard to try to honor all of that in our evaluation process, in spite of these little boxes that we were being asked to be put into. So my focus really was on believing that if we support teacher development and teacher growth and support teachers, the test scores will take care of themselves, and we will, and we can look at them as a measure, but we need to look at other measures. And so my focus was really on a well-articulated curriculum, multiple measures of growth, and giving teachers really the tools they need, because the job is so challenging. Yeah. Kind of getting out of their way, but also getting them what they need while holding them accountable. So it's complex. And again, working with families. We had significant parent involvement and support from our parents and stakeholders. We worked really hard at that because we knew that, you don't just educate a child during these school hours, right? It's a whole village. And as in every district I worked in, parents want to be involved in their child's education. They need to feel welcomed into that. So that was really important to me. And then, of course, safety and security after Columbine and all of the things that have happened to public schools over the years. We spent a significant amount of our time working on security, security, and making sure we could do everything we could to keep our schools safe so children could learn and not just be focused on fear, those kinds of things. So education's become very complex over time. And I didn't live through during COVID. Imagine that now. Like that's a whole level of what people went through in public education, any education.
And I just had a question, because you mentioned September 11th. Could you describe that day and how things operated at the school? Or because I know some places they had children go home and didn't come to school that day because of what had happened.
Well, we know what time that happened, right? So school had just started, right? It was we did the pledge at 9:05 every morning. So and again, at the time, we were less connected to our phones and getting, alerts on what's happening in the world. So, it was a big deal that we had cable TV in in the classrooms, right? And we had already put in place a communication system that in the event of an emergency, we had key teachers at each grade level who would have someone show up to replace them so they could report to a central location. So we put that system in place, called the teachers together, then put a television on in a conference room to kind of be like, what is going on, And what I'll not ever forget is just from there, many of us were then heading off to this funeral for a former teacher. And it was like, okay, should I go? Should I not go? I got there and was told about the Pentagon, right? And I was like, I have to go back because we still didn't really know what had happened at that point. The information we did get was, getting the hospitals on alert. Like that's all we were focused on. Like how, we thought there would be people who could be at hospitals. And then we quickly started to make sure teachers had televisions off in classrooms as parents started to understand what was happening. And again, our PTA mobilized quickly and just showed up. How can we help? What should we do? And so we posted parents at doors. We started to work with teachers in figuring out if there were students whose families might be impacted by this, directly. So I can still remember realizing that somehow that one of the students' parents was on a flight somewhere. And I thought, we need to find out what that's about. And then, making sure that parent wasn't on the flight, that went down in Pennsylvania. But we quickly did learn that we did have staff who were directly impacted by family members being there. And many parents were showing up to pick their children up. Many parents. And so that's where our PTA parents really stepped up to help us. Okay, yes, that's his mother. Go get that child, and then we tried to work hard to support parents on how to talk to your children about this as we were trying to figure out what to talk about,
Yeah.
So it took a lot of days. We did a lot of work with helping teachers talk to children. We actually ran a series for families who maybe just wanted to draw, write, think. And then, those who were impacted, going to services, going to annual memorials, we're close to New York.
Yes.
So it was a lot.
And just as your time as superintendent in Mattituck, I was curious with some of the new things that were coming into the school systems, like with the cell phones, and how, because I know even in 2007, that was a new challenge, more so with cell phones. But as I think even up to now, it's still something that's talked about, how we deal with student engagement. And I mean, I even remember when I was in high school, kind of the vaping was coming into play, and just how do you deal with that, because you don't smell it the same way. So, but do you remember kind of some of the things that was that being discussed of how to deal with that? And
right, so cell phone technology, again, think flip phone, right? It's not what you picture today with different kind of a small computer in your hand. So in the early stages, there weren't elementary school kids who had phones. I mean, eventually there were, right? And parents wanted their kids to have phone after certain things that happened in the world, right? And then teachers at the secondary level, what we were at the time exploring was like, how do we utilize this as a teaching tool? How do we have kids, be able to, manage a calendar on their phone and put their homework in, or, use the school portal for getting information, handing in homework, flipped classroom, where maybe you watch a video in the evening and then you come and do what was traditionally homework in school, where I can coach you on your learning, like shifting, that kind of a, so at the time it was still seen as kind of a tool, but, social media was mostly instant message and, but so that the impact of students being able to use either computer or phones and communicate, now all kinds of other things are happening socially. And they all have parents who don't know what that is, because we didn't have that, right? So they were teaching us. Remember, I don't know, maybe you remember this parent over shoulder. So kids would use that to be like, all right, stop typing to me now. I'm supposed to be doing my homework. I have my parents, because you had one computer in your house at the time, right? It wasn't like anybody had a laptop.
Yes.
So the computer was at least in a place where most of us could kind of see, like, well, doesn't look like homework. That looks like a game, So the technology was new enough that it was definitely on our radar. And then navigating the policy and procedures around, if something happens online and someone tells us about it the next day, like, whose job is, how do we monitor things that then spill over into a school day for some kids because something maybe happened online in the evening.
And so you worked up until 2018. What are you most proud of with what you've done for the school district? Because I think from what I've heard, it's one of the best school districts on the North Fork.
The school districts are all amazing on the North Fork, and the thing actually I liked a lot about being superintendent was the ability to collaborate with all of the other school districts and my colleagues, and look for ways to combine programs and do as much as we could to enrich what our students' experiences. So again, probably what I feel most proud of was, again, continuing to usher in this culture of accountability while honoring teachers. That was really a big thing at that time and challenging for us. And then I like to think of my skill set really being around planning, strategic planning, goal setting, measuring growth toward goals. So I did a lot of work with teams on establishing a strong mission, vision, and are we aligning with what is important to us while meeting these other pressures and mandates? But what does our community think is most important, and are we achieving that for our families? So I did a lot of work with, a new mission statement, and one that they still use. So that team of people did a good job. If you don't have to keep changing it, if it still makes sense to guide what you're trying to accomplish. And then that K through 12 curriculum development that kind of leads students through a progression of learning and not just finishing a grade and then going to the next, like that connected, integrated curriculum.
And so after working there, you retired from that career and COVID happened. But then this past year, you decided to run for Southold Town Council. How did that come about?
So when I retired, I did take a stretch of time to not say yes to doing anything. I even had been doing some college teaching and some graduate school teaching and decided to step back from that for a bit, kind of like take a beat. And so with COVID, then it was like, I think I had just at that time joined a committee at the Mattituck-Laurel Civic, and then I was on the board, and then I was asked to be president. So I kind of was, voted in to be president. And then we did everything on Zoom after that. And my adult children each because of COVID, ended up finding their way home, right? So now I have 3 adult children, 1 girlfriend. Were there any other significant? Yeah, two girlfriends. And dealing with, who is still going out to work and how do we quarantine? And but the gift in that for me was that I had everyone under one roof for a while, right? I always said to my kids, like, I finally got to be the stay-at-home mom. I never got to be like, I'm cooking for everyone and I'm putting out menus. I feel like I ran a small inn for a while. So as challenging as that time was, because it was pretty challenging, I had this little gift of time, although my kids were not thrilled about having to leave where they were living, and it just made sense, right? In fact, everybody was someplace different and they all ended up home. So I was running the Civic, doing a lot of work with them, again, looking at goals, looking at alignment. The town had just about implemented their comprehensive plan, so the civics were very involved with those community meetings, and I had a lot of interest in how that was going. So that work was really great. We worked on the corner in Mattituck that we're going to eventually turn into a park. Like the Civic was very involved in saving that corner. A lot of work with community engagement, even though we were all online and supporting people through COVID. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in August of 2021, our youngest passed away suddenly from a fentanyl-laced drug use that, as I said to you before, should not have taken his life, but did. And he was in LA after a beautiful, long cross-country trip with his girlfriend. They both had just finished working on the show Severance. They were going to travel with her family before coming back to work on season 2. So that obviously kind of brought our life to a grinding halt. And fortunately, obviously the Civic carried on without me. And so a good 2 years of just taking care of ourselves followed, with a lot of love and support. This community, I call it's like a deep well of courage, because many people will tell you that you need strength when you experience, especially an out of order loss. But what I found was what we needed most was courage and love, which we had a lot of. So bit by bit, I was asked first by Sonia Spar to help out with the Antibias Task Force Helen Prince Award event. And that felt really good to do. We honored Pauline Smith from the North Fork Head Start. So that felt good. And then I was asked to consider being on the Housing Advisory Commission, because I had done a lot of work with that through the Civic and trying to tackle that issue. And then, an invitation to coffee with Al Krupski and a conversation with him, and then a few other people. It just, came to me like in 3 different ways. And I was like, maybe I should consider this, so after a big consult with the family, like, do you think I could do this? Like physically, emotionally, and every way possible, because it has never been appealing to me to run for office, but it has always been appealing to me to lead change, right? But to do it at a town level, you have to run for office first. And that experience was also phenomenal, because I ran with this great team of people. I learned so much. And what was most refreshing for me, with, having to kind of reset my brain following or integrating grief, you have to like rethink how you think and how you see the world, and it clearly changes how you see things. And there was just something that started to make sense to me. And the best thing about it was I wasn't an expert on anything. And it was so great to be in like the curious seat again of, tell me more about that. What is that? I don't know about that. As opposed to being superintendent, where not only are you expected to know everything, you kind of can know everything when you've done it for 35 years, right? And this was like, wait, I don't know what that is. So this idea of In baseball, they call it next man up. This idea of I will take my turn. I will step up. And it felt like an outgrowth of community service. It didn't feel like what you think about when you think about going into politics. So it was quite a great journey, and so far so good.
Was that experience just kind of deciding if you really wanted to decide on going into a town government position? And you had talked about that you had taken time the last 2 years, really, because that's just going through that situation and not sure what, like you said, it's like it kind of changes you in some ways, and how to deal with that, and just, I guess, having this opportunity with people in the community asking you to get involved. Was that something that you had expected, or you weren't? And then you said you kind of weren't sure. But...
Well, yeah. So it was never on my list to run for office. It had been talked about to me in different capacities from different people, and I was like, why would I do that? Like, I have a leadership job. I love my job, and I loved the idea of working at the civic kind of level. So it was really through a lot of conversation, primarily with Ron, with my husband, about, how would we take this on, knowing it was going to really have to shift our energy and put us very much back in the public when we had been really protective of our hearts and our space. And, my daughter, Rebecca, who now lives in Hawaii, and Jacob, who's kind of in New York and kind of in LA and back and forth. And, how was this going to fit in, both in terms of the demands on my time and, would I be able to really handle that, like, emotional space that I still needed and still need. Right? You need it forever. So the assurance from Ron that, we could do this, and he was in completely. I mean, he loved doing all the events with me. It got us both up and out and in the community, connecting with people, and talking about what was going on in our hearts and our minds, and then kind of getting excited about something, that would be both meaningful and purposeful. So I felt that, with my family's support and with the support of this community, why not step up and be part of a team that can tackle the big issues the town's facing right now.
And now that it's been over 100 days that you've been in office, how has it been so far, kind of looking back on those first 100 days?
Yeah. So right after the election, 2 days after the election, and we didn't actually have the official results, we got on a plane and went to see our daughter in Hawaii for a month, knowing that I probably had won and I would have to start January 1, right? And we were not going to get to see her. So Jacob came there too, and we had Thanksgiving there, and kind of got my feet back under me after the election, not realizing how exhausting that whole process would be. And I would say we hit the ground running. I mean, we were left in good shape with a great comp plan. Supervisor Russell and the town board got the zoning project up and running before we started. We were really able to just kind of grab the baton, and keep going. I would say we have a really high functioning board. We work really well together. We're kind of learning our way. For me, being the newest member, Supervisor Krupski has, it's nothing to him. He's been doing this for a long time. So kind of getting up to speed for me was like, how do things work? How do we prepare for meetings? How does everything work? There's a lot, So I spent the first month really spending time in each of the town departments and kind of getting to know people. We have an incredible staff in town hall. And then kind of stepping back and learning, like I really did a lot of watching and learning in the beginning. And now we're on our committees. We're all working away at the zoning project, tackling the housing issue. So I stayed on as liaison to the Housing Commission with Councilwoman Doherty, and she and I had already worked together on that. So that was like, just keep going. And then I find myself on the Land Preservation Commission and the Water Committee. I think I'm on one more, Transportation. And we just started the Parks and Recreation Committee. So Brian Mealy and I are on that team together.
And what, in terms of Southold Township, what are kind of 3 issues that are important to you?
Well, the zoning update project, although I knew it was important, it wasn't like, oh, I can't wait to do that. We're fully in that process now, and I have learned quite a bit because we've had all of these 7 or 8 community forums already. So that has really bubbled up to the top. But inside of that are the other issues, right? Or concurrent. So the Housing Advisory Commission, all the work we're doing to help with affordable housing, either for rent or for purchase, and then environmental protection. I mean, look at all of the flooding we already have, and the development pressure. It all kind of ties together. So it's hard to say there are 3. I like to think of it more as, we're at Penn Station and all the trains are running. Like you can't be where we are now as a community and try to do one thing at a time. You really and that's what's great about I'm feeling from this board is we're willing to kind of divide and conquer the work and trust each other and communicate on how best to get things done. I mean, Brian and I just had a meeting with some community members and Nick Krupski from Solid Waste on diverting food scraps and trying to get, that environmentally. You can take small pieces and tackle them, knowing they're connected to solving other issues. So that is connected to the water. It all connects. And I think that's what I'm learning I bring to the table is I'm a systems thinker. I like to see how things work. I like to put things in place. I've taken on a project to assess and support each of the town committees, commissions, all those groups, community populated committees, and make sure that everyone's functioning well, that people are achieving the goals they're supposed to be achieving. How does it line up with so going back to what I talked about in the school district, like what were our goals? Are we achieving those goals? Is this the best use of our time? What should we be spending our money on? Sort of making the system work better, because then the community engagement is stronger. And I will say that the number one thing I ran on or for was to, which kind of takes me back to what I was saying about our, losing Caleb, was this notion of experiencing the strength and courage of this community made me want to keep that network really strong, and I talk about the well of courage, but if you don't keep feeding the well, the next person isn't going to have anything there, right? So we have to build that. So it could be that we're developing relationships because we care about the zoning project, but guess what? We're also developing relationships. Or we're going to meet with Kathy from CAST in a couple of weeks and talk about what are the needs, what are the other needs in our community? What are we not seeing that we need to see and value in all members of our community? So to me, that's the ultimate measure as to whether or not I've done what I've set out to do.
And so you're on the housing committee?
It's actually the Housing Advisory Commission. It's considered a commission, yeah.
Okay. What do you think are kind of, in terms of trying to tackle housing, it is a very complex issue, and with the amount of resources the limited resources we have out here in the land and space, and trying to figure out how to work within, because you're also on the land preservation too. So how do we preserve the land without creating, keeping the North Fork, as a lot of people, as what we don't want to lose the open space at the same time, or say more like close, like more suburban sprawl,
Right.
that you might see more western Suffolk. How is that something that, what do you kind of think of that?
So that is an interesting observation, that, you can sit on the Housing Commission and the, two committees, land preservation and water, right, which are all about coastal resilience, quality of water. We can't have a lot of density and still protect the land, right? And we need to support agriculture and aquaculture. And how do we keep the water clean? Well, if we build too many houses, now we have more nitrogen. People use pesticides. These things don't jive together nicely, right?
Yeah.
So the Housing Advisory Commission works with the Housing Advisory. There was a Housing Advisory Committee that wrote the plan, and I'm a plan person, right? So I'm like, so what did the plan say we were going to do, and how can we start to do that? And then again, back to multiple tracks. So you look for ways you can start to solve small bits of the housing issue, and then work across the community to say, so if we need some density in housing, do we work through zoning to make that happen? Should the town be buying property to make that happen? So those are all the questions we're grappling with. Because the town isn't going to get into the housing business, right? But the town is responsible to be sure that the town has a healthy and diverse housing market, and we don't have that right now. What Ron and I did in 1985, two teachers couldn't do now.
Yes.
It would be really challenging. So, we can't bring back that time when there were nice little ranch houses for sale for starter houses, or they're not there, right? They've been bought, they're being rebuilt, they're big houses now. So we're not going to give up on preserving land and open space and supporting the agriculture history that we have here. So solving the housing issue is going to mean really looking at what existing structures do we have? Where are they? Can they be retrofitted? If we built something small here and something small, can we spread that out? And there'll be a meeting this week on the application process for a grant to help people build detached units on their property, or renovate existing structures. So again, it's kind of multi-pronged, but also meeting with the hospital and meeting with the local fire departments, and how do we support housing for those, frontline workers that we need housing for, like now. It's hard for those kinds of areas that need staff to attract people who don't want to drive 2 hours in traffic to get here. But there's really no place to say, well, we have apartments you could rent, or that kind of thing. So we're kind of, again, coming at that in a variety of ways, and at the same time tackling the short-term rental policy and the Airbnb issue. So that committee, there's a committee on that. And somehow these things will start to dovetail, and hopefully, we'll see some progress.
And then you're also on the public transportation. Is that another advisory committee? The
Transportation Commission has been in existence for a long time. And there are, again, this is where my work on all the committees has come out. I'm like, let me go back to the resolution that started this committee. Let me look at, there's a whole chapter in the comp plan on transportation. I'm like, there are a lot of goals in there, right? And so we meet once a month. We are populated by volunteers. So our job is to say to town board, what are the priorities and how can we help, right? So like we just finished a project on on purchasing and locating and hopefully soon installing, bike racks across the town. That's not solving our traffic issue, but it is related to promoting using bikes and not using cars and that kind of thing. So, that commission has a lot of work to do in terms of traffic calming, in terms of, connected streets, trying to get the sidewalks up to back, where they need to be, and then promoting the use of public transportation. But that's a big challenge too, because we don't control the train schedule.
So the train and then even the bus service is not. And
so we work with the county, we work with the state. We work on all of those things again at the same time.
And for the train, is that something that working with the Long Island Railroad in terms of, I know Riverhead is working on a transit hub plan and possibly making it so that at least people on the North Fork would only have to drive to Riverhead instead of driving to Ronkonkoma for more frequency and services. But has that been something that has been discussed for Southold Town in terms of getting more frequency out here?
I know it's been discussed in the past. It hasn't been a recent discussion, but I know it did come up quite a bit during the campaign as something that people would like us to look at in terms of finding ways to still have the tourism industry that kind of keeps our economy going, but not changing the quality of life with all of the traffic or becoming, just sort of like these long waits to just get to where you can relax,
Yes.
So that's an issue that's going to definitely take a lot of time and attention. And the Transportation Commission, we don't really have a long-term plan about that. So I think that's a good long-term topic to bring there, and probably other committees as well.
Yes. And just kind of living and working on the North Fork for a while, what have you enjoyed about your time working and living out here?
When I was working in the schools, my colleagues in other districts would say, how do you do that? How do you live and work in the school? And I absolutely thought it was great, to be part of the community where you're leading. But I think that's a function of that this is a respectful community. So it wasn't like it was hard for me to be out in public if people didn't like a decision I made in the school. People were included in that decision making. And so I felt like it was sort of seamless, whether I was in public shopping and answering a question, or it actually lends itself to what public life is like now. People see you, they want to tell you what's on their mind. I'm used to stopping and saying, sure, I'd love to hear about that, or could we talk tomorrow, So I think that sense of sort of really blending my worlds in terms of living and working in the community is really, I really love it. And then, of course, my kids growing up and knowing all of their friends. And now I'm working with them in town hall. I mean, my daughter's had a classmate who's now running the land preservation department. Like, oh, I remember you from fourth grade, it's kind of this beautiful system of connectedness. Although I remember I did a focus group with students one year about what makes Mattituck. And they're like, the good news is it's a small town and everyone knows each other. The bad news is it's a small town and everyone knows each other. So it's like for the kids, sometimes it was like, everybody knows everything about me and they won't forget that one thing I did in fourth grade, So that kind of.
And I did have another question, just about how it might have impact you, because you said you've always been working with mental health and the importance of mental health, but with the loss of your son Caleb, you've continued to work on trying to improve and address issues of mental health and drug overdose on the North Fork. And I think it's definitely a problem that doesn't seem like it gets talked about as much. And with just trying to work, even with children and young adults that went through COVID, and that has to have an impact on them, and just how you kind of have continued to work in that area and be a voice for mental health.
So as superintendent, along with my colleague Dave Gamberg, who was superintendent in both Greenport and Southold, we started a group, a stakeholder group called the North Fork Coalition for Behavioral Health. And our goal with our legislative partners, particularly at the time, Senator Laval and Assemblyman Palumbo and Assemblyman Thiel on the South Fork, our goal was to bring more crisis response interventions closer to home and to make services available so that when families were in crisis, they didn't have to go all the way to Stony Brook to get either emergency or even regular kind of intervention, partial hospitalization, that kind of thing. And we worked very hard with both hospitals, with Family Service League, with people at the county level, with local healthcare providers, and designed this approach, and were able to secure funding from New York State to expand Family Service League's presence on the North Fork, to help families who needed psychiatric, sort of the medical end of this kind of thing, and then work with, the umbrella term is behavioral health. The subcategories are mental health and substance use disorders, and they're often connected, right? Chicken or the egg kind of thing. And then leading forward to also making sure we're doing prevention and creating positive environments for students. So yes, things like loneliness and isolation that COVID brought for students, has had that ripple effect. But at the same time, it also brought it to the front, right? Because everyone was experiencing isolation and anxiety. And so folks who were living with that were like, oh, good, now you all know what I've been talking about because you're experiencing it firsthand. And yet at the same time, it's like, okay, now we've brought this all to the surface. Do we have enough providers? And do we have enough providers in healthcare, period, following COVID, right? We need to inspire more people to go into all of those fields. So now working as town councilwoman, I led that coalition with David. Then when I retired, Senator Laval asked me to stay on and continue just to lead that piece. And that meant making sure there was a meeting, making sure there was an agenda, making sure all the people are at the table. So I did that for a period of time in retirement, and all Zoom based. So now coming in as councilwoman, I did ask the town board, I would like to be your liaison, because when Bill Ruland was on the town board, he was our liaison. He had been my former school board president. So as town councilman, he was part of that initial team. And I felt that link had then, we lost that. So I kind of now represent the town as councilwoman in that initiative. Again, a different role, right? I'm not on the ground with teachers and students and what's going on. It's like, dear schools, do you have what you need? And how can we help?
Yes.
Yeah, so that work will continue. And then, as far as the opioid crisis and that significant loss our country experiences every year, with that, still so many lives every day. The hospital, groups like Kate's Angels, there's been a response, and you see, Narcan rescue stations. You probably have one here. Yes. Right? Yes. You have that here. You didn't have that a few years ago. No. Even that's a sign of wow, we need that, and we do, right? Yeah. We'd like to not need it someday. So I don't feel like I have this significant role in moving all of that forward, because I know there are a lot of really dedicated people who know about this, who are doing that, including Stony Brook Medicine and Eastern Long Island Hospital, and the work they do in Riverhead, and trying to bring those services to adolescents, and not just adults, because right now most of the services in that area out here are for 18 and over, and we're looking to bring that down because kids. I was just at a conference with our student resource officers in Riverhead, just looking at the accessibility to over-the-counter products that are labeled as supplements that actually have certain substances in them that are called natural, but actually do activate opioid receptors in the brain, and it's pretty dangerous. That's a whole new thing that didn't exist before. There's like another layer that we need to know about.
Like you said, I think unfortunately you need to bring the age down a bit, because I think otherwise you're going to come into it a little bit later, where a lot of young teens have already been introduced to there was another drug, but just introduced to certain substances at an early age. So unfortunately, I think that's something that needs to be addressed then. And like you said, it is, I don't know if I remember reading that for fentanyl each year it's at least 100,000.
Think about it as a plane crash a day. That's still the number. It may have come down a little bit, and I don't know like who gets caught in that number, like if it's just a certain age, but it tends to be 20s and 30s. But they are finding other issues are cropping up, trends and patterns that are not necessarily in that same area, same substance, but do concern us as the adults when kids' brains are still developing, and they're finding that they're having these cravings and need that's unsettling.
And even I've seen that there's been more less frequency of students attending school. They've been more absent or taking more days off. And I don't know if that's more through just mental health, taking a mental health day, but I think that was just they've been recording data throughout Long Island saying that the students haven't been attending high school or middle school as regularly. They've been taking more days off.
I have read about that, and I don't think it's just a local issue. I think it's more of a national trend, and it certainly warrants study by those who need children in school.
Yes. And then just lastly, what do you hope for the future of Southold Town and the community down the line?
I think that's a hard question. I do. If I could only give you one thing, I do hope we are able to turn the tide on sort of who gets to live here. That we are able to kind of recharge the area with, all ages of people, and where people can imagine being able to have a lifetime here. Again, I'm going to my daughter's age group, 30 years old, kids who grew up here, kids who are working hard and have decent salaries and maybe qualify for a mortgage, but they can't qualify the mortgage they would need to purchase a house right now on the North Fork, and yet want to continue to be solid part of this community. So therefore, I'm sure we're not attracting other people here to say like, oh, maybe I'll live on the North Fork. Let me go look at houses, that would be like, if we are successful at some point in time, I'd pick a time and I would see a truly diverse housing market and a thriving economy while we're, shoring up our coastline and keeping our water clean and our land healthy for farming.
Yes.
I think, as you think, we have to think of ourselves almost as change leaders, because we know change is going to happen, right? Things have changed since I've been here. Things have probably changed since I walked down the stairs. Change is going to happen. It's how you manage it and how you work with it, and then how you kind of know where you want to get, and try to put the pieces in place. So everyone can have a nice quality of life. Everyone who lives here.
Absolutely.
It's that to me would be a good measure of success.
Yes. And then I just ask if there was anything else you'd like to discuss or say, something we hadn't talked about.
What's kind of striking me as I sit here in a library is, I don't know, I was just thinking about how, in spite of all the obstacles we keep talking about and all of the change and all of the pressures, you can still, walk into a school, you can walk into our libraries, you can walk into town hall, you can walk into our rec center, and you still have this sense of community. I might not know everyone I just walked past, but everyone's smiling and nodding. Like there's this sense of that. And I think we actually, even during the, sort of the more seasonal part of the year that makes us a lot more populated, I think that is still why people come here. Most people come here. And so I just think that's something we need to honor. I was at the opening for the art show that you have here now.
Yes.
And I was as lifted by the art as I was by the number of people here, and sort of this range of people that I know in different ways, but they were all here over art. So I just thought there's, you see a lot of that more focus on culture and art. Like you look at the movie theater in Greenport, I think there's this swell of, whoa, we really do want, as much as people say, I want open space and I want things to be the way it was, 25 years ago. I think what people really want is to be part of a strong community where they know they can turn to each other and will have each other's back. And I think that's, no matter what else changes, we can keep making that happen.
Yes. I think out of interviewing multiple people and talking to them, I would say community is one of the most important things, is still, like you said, having that community, even if we're still trying to work on all these other, you want to make sure we can still interact and work together.
It's actually the most important natural resource we have, is when we build capacity through relationship, that's the energy we need to take care of all these other things, right?
Yes.
And sometimes that's the byproduct. So I might have a transportation commission meeting that we talk a long time about bike racks, but what we've come out of that is we all care about this thing and we're working on it together. So now maybe we'll work on something else together. To me, community matters above all else. And I think that might mean different things for different people. When I go to Natalie Wimberly's church at Coming to the Table and we talk about the history of racism in our community, like those are moments that make us stronger. And that's probably what we need to preserve above all else.
Yes. Because in the end, we're all humans just trying to work together, and that we shouldn't create these barriers, or like even with racism, and we need to work together as a community. And that's the most important thing that we have that connects us all. Yeah.
And I would say that the thing that struck me the most, I remember it was the night of the election results coming in, and I thought, this process of running and Ron and I being at all of these events and connecting with people was experiencing that deep humanity that we all have, and thinking about making sure that everyone who lives here is valued and seen as an asset, and part of making us better, instead of kind of putting people in categories and deciding, who has needs and who doesn't, as opposed to what are we all bringing forward, and how do we cultivate the assets of all people to have a good quality of life.
Absolutely. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
You're welcome.
And your involvement in the community through our schools, as well as continuing it through the town board, and your involvement in working on important issues. So I really want to thank you so much for coming in today. It was a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, it was great. It's great to talk to you. Thank you. Just talking about things helps you figure them out.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 101 with Ann Smith. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.